This is The Record on KUOW. I'm Bill Radke. On the campaign trail, President Trump announced his vision for American foreign policy. He called it America First.
After the Cold War, our foreign policy veered badly off course. Logic was replaced with foolishness and arrogance, which led to one foreign policy disaster after another. It all began with the dangerous idea that we could make Western democracies out of countries that had no experience or interest in becoming a Western democracy. Our foreign policy is a complete and total disaster.
In his first year, the president withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, left the Paris Climate Agreement, rolled back ties with Cuba. He also called for airstrikes on Syria in retaliation for Assad's use of chemical weapons on civilians. He met with the North Korean president to talk denuclearization, but his foreign policy message remains the same: less foreign intervention. Former UN Ambassador Rick Barton disagrees with Trump, says the U.S. has an advantage in the world and we should be doing more to build peace. Ambassador Barton teaches at the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton University. Thanks for coming, Ambassador.
Hey, my pleasure.
Let's begin with Trump then. What is the actual Trump doctrine as far as you can tell when it comes to intervention?
Well, I think it's like so much of his presidency is highly personalized, and so it's hard to tell, and very reactive to events or whatever is going on. My argument is that the United States has an advantaged position. We shouldn't be arrogant about it. We should, in fact, be very humble about it. We should recognize that it is a blessing, and that if it's overplayed and if it's over-militarized, if it's overactive, hyperactive, that we can get ourselves into 17-year wars in places like Afghanistan. So it suggests that there's a wiser way to do it. But at the end of the day, wars and instability have a way of finding the United States and finding their way to our shores and finding in a variety of ways. And they also shrink the world that we live in. And it's the expanding world, and it's the opportunities that have come to the United States as a result of its leadership that are gigantic assets. So don't be arrogant. I mean, he's right on a couple of these points. We have been arrogant. We have gone in there in ways that have not been effective. We've encouraged war in some places. And I make the argument that I've now had enough experience to see that you can do it a much better way. And if the American people are engaged and care and have to actually, and they know that it might require some of our tax dollars and other sacrifices, and we had the Congress vote on it, there are a lot of things we could be doing that would make it a much more engaged approach, and then it wouldn't be quite so willy-nilly as it might be right now.
Well, then let's talk about the engagement of the American people. There seemed to be a big chunk of people receptive to the message that, oh, we don't have to have foreign entanglements and quagmires.
Yeah.
And as you write, American public opinion matters. Yeah. So what do you do about that?
Well, I mean, the first thing is you tell the American public that their opinion will actually be heard. Because in the case of these several of these conflicts, the opposition really hasn't been heard. There have not been good debates in Congress. There have not been official votes. So what's the point of my caring a lot if I don't have any way to express it and it doesn't have any influence on what's going on? So that part of the argument, I think, actually unites the left and the right quite well, but it speaks to a Congress that has been not particularly active. And of the last 20 conflicts, that's been the story. And then we get some sweeping, war on terrorism or whatever legislation that kind of gives a blanket to presidents to do whatever they might choose to do. So that's attacked from multiple places, and I think rightly so. I happen to be one of the few people that really liked President Obama saying that he was going to go to the U.S. Congress, even though there was time
for declarations of war.
Yeah, and there was time to do something about Syria's gassing its own people, but the Congress should vote on that. Poof, that was the end of that. Now, he didn't have enough time to fight the Congress for another 3 months on that, and on top of other issues.
Well, could he really have won over the Congress when it comes to interfere especially after the Iraq and Afghanistan? I mean, what was the public appetite for getting involved anymore in Syria than they are.
I think it would have to,
including in Congress representing that.
I think it would have to have been very well thought through and much more tailored. And right now, we have a couple thousand Americans in Syria. We've flattened entire cities. That's become sort of the new Chechenification of American interventions. That is not part of what I argue for in Peace Works.
Well, what's your answer for Syria?
Well, I mean, I think in the case of Syria, that the earlier interventions, the earlier opportunities were first on the humanitarian side. That we should have argued for an assertive humanitarianism, which would have insisted that the long-held and even recently voted humanitarian initiatives by the United Nations should be able to be carried out and not suppressed by the Assad regime.
Yeah, but they're a sovereign government, so you can't force that on them.
No, but the sovereign government argument, we know, is obviously one of the places that cowards hide out. And we saw in the Kosovo War that there were airdrops. In the Bosnian War, there was an airlift into Sarajevo that was not supported really by the Serbs. And in Berlin, obviously, the Russians weren't particularly enthusiastic about the airlift that we did there. So if something like that had been initiated in Aleppo, it would have been a clear sign that, okay, your sovereignty has a limit, and among the limits would be gassing your people and violating every international humanitarian standard. So that's an assertive way that you use a non-political avenue, which happens to be humanitarian assistance, in a very political way to make a point. I also think that that the targeted responses to Assad's gas attacks, if you do that again, I can guarantee you that you will lose this palace or you will lose those planes. And I think that this was, for me, what was different about the Syrian war than maybe the Libyan and the Iraq wars is that I think that Assad is ruthless, but actually kind of sane and rational, whereas Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi probably were like teenage boys who just had a couple too many decades running their countries.
Former UN Ambassador Rick Barton is author of the new book Peace Works. Well, let's talk about the people from Central America, mostly Honduras, traveling toward the U.S. border. What's your take on who they are and why they're on the move?
Well, I think they're on the move because they are scared in their own countries. First off, there's direct violence. They have the highest homicide rates in the world outside of a war zone. They're scared because they're living under mostly authoritarian regimes where there's no sense of what's going to happen to me the next day or whether I could get any kind of justice. And then they want more for themselves, so they're ambitious for some economic opportunities.
You expect them all to apply for U.S. asylum at an official checkpoint?
No, I don't. I think that, first off, most of them probably won't make it to that far. This is really hard work, and at least historically, the fact that they're traveling together increases some of their chances of some of them making it there because they won't get picked off as they go. But this is really difficult. It's a difficult struggle. So I think the obvious choice here, and the choice that my book really argues for, is help people where they live to make the best choices they can and to follow their own instincts. And so the United States is a catalyst for giving people those opportunities. We're not a colonial power. We escaped colonialism. We know how awful it was.
And perpetrated it in places.
And when we do it, it's never very good. And we occupy places like Haiti for a decade or two. It doesn't work. And lots of people die, and it doesn't help the soul of America, from my view.
So what would you do with Honduras?
But I actually had a chance to work in Honduras in my last job as the Assistant Secretary of State for Conflict and Stabilization Operations. And we just felt that the first thing that had to happen is that their political system needed to recognize that the homicides were the number one problem in their country. They had to get on top of that. And in every way. The first way was in recognizing that was their number one problem. And of course, in the presidential campaign, 2 presidential campaigns ago in Honduras, they did recognize this as the number one issue, and every candidate addressed it, partially because we helped them to focus on this, but also it then shows up in things like, if a homicide takes place, will any of the witnesses ever testify? Will the police actually take the testimony in a reliable way that doesn't result in the death of the witness? Will the courts actually move quickly enough? I mean, these are all very practical problems that, on the other hand, there were successes in Honduras. It wasn't like every policeman couldn't do an investigation and every prosecutor couldn't prosecute and every judge couldn't figure out a way. And there was a group right in downtown Tegucigalpa that was in the worst part of Tegucigalpa that was getting an 85% conviction rate. Now, if it's happening in one place in Honduras, could it happen anywhere else in Honduras? Well, of course it could. And so taking those experiences and trying to nationalize them and helping them to popularize them and recognizing that Hondurans could actually solve their own problems, those are all things the United States can help with, and they're inexpensive, and they don't require. For a while there in Honduras, we actually had a prosecutor from Seattle down there advising their prosecutors on how to build the cases on some of the high-profile cases, and that was useful, but not anywhere near as useful as finding the local example that we could build off of.
Do we have the trust of the people of Honduras, where the U.S. has been intervening since? Banana companies, building railroads and banks 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago.
So our checkered past is clearly a problem for us. On the other hand, many of these people don't have great choices. So they may not be totally trusting of us, but 40% of them trust us, and 22% of them trust their own government. So, it's oftentimes it's comparative.
This is former UN Ambassador Rick Barton. Can we talk about Yemen, where the United Nations says dozens of children are dying every day because about the civil war there? The medical services are collapsing. The U.S. is not a neutral actor. What should the United States do?
Well, I'm afraid that this is another one of these cases where we've overreached, and our being a primary arms supplier to the Saudis leaves us with a very limited set of choices. We have tried diplomatically. Some of my friends have been ambassadors and served in Yemen for the United States and as UN negotiators as well. And I don't have a comfortable or clean or a simple answer to that one, and because I really haven't worked on it, even though I've worked in over 40 conflicts, unfortunately I've not worked in Yemen, but it does strike me as if the downward direction of the whole country and the growth in population and the very, very limited resources and natural opportunities helps to feed this witch's brew that's being stirred there now.
Well, Saudi Arabia has been an ally a long time. Here's a question: what would President Obama do any differently?
Yeah, I'm not sure that President Obama would. I don't know what he would have done. He did obviously try the diplomatic route at some length with very limited effect. But I think that one of the things that my book really brings out is that we oftentimes don't know the places very well. And I would put Yemen in that sort of small, curious place that very few Americans know. And I've got a really simple rule of thumb to keep us all honest, which is if you don't know at least 100 people in a place, don't send U.S. soldiers, and that would probably go for armaments as well.
I mean, if the president doesn't know 100 people, or the general and the chief of staff of the Defense Department?
I would say if the United States doesn't, if all we know is 6 ministers and 3 or 4 international diplomats and 10 business people, that's not a good base. And by the way, if we followed that rule, we probably wouldn't have been stuck in Afghanistan for 17 years, and we probably could have even avoided Vietnam, which we knew relatively well. But many of these places, we get to know our 100th person after we've been there for 6 or 8 months. That's a pretty dangerous. How about if we spend the time up front?
Well, what about Iraq, where the United States? We know 100 people in Iraq. We're not nearly as much of a stranger, and obviously it didn't go well.
We do now, but I'm not convinced that we did when we went into the place. In fact, they're
I remember hearing Baghdad called the Paris of Iraq.
Yeah, it might have been, but it didn't feel like any part of Paris that I've ever seen when I was there. It felt like something could go wrong any second. And I was there at a very good time when the U.S. had just completed its first military sweep. But I didn't have any feeling that we were grounded in the place, because all we'd basically been doing is we'd been working in the Kurdish part of the country quite a bit before the war, and we had been enforcing a no-fly zone through big parts of the country. But our on-the-ground knowledge of Iraq was very, very limited, and it wasn't current. And even after the long war we fought there and evacuated, when the ISIS problems started to arise, I was visited by one of America's senior-most generals who had been responsible for the intelligence gathering during the first big phase of the war there. And I said to him, well, you must have hundreds of intelligence contacts still. And he looked at me like, no, we don't. And so, this is where our humility is a long way from where it needs to be.
Your book includes the subtitle is about a unifying role in a turbulent world. Mm-hmm. Sure doesn't feel very unified here. What can we? Yeah. How can this country unify anyone?
Well, we have a lot of work to do ourselves, and obviously our reverting to hate speech and to everything being us versus them. I mean, most of us don't know 10 people who have an opposing point of political view that we talk with on a regular basis, and certainly if we do talk with them, never about this. So that's not a very healthy grounding for our international work. But sometimes our international work can be a unifying source for us as well, because it does make us recognize some of these fundamental qualities that we may be lacking in introspection. My great-grandfather was a Protestant minister, and he had a line that I just love because I think it's so true. He said, the human stomach can digest anything except for introspection. And, we all need to be a bit more thoughtful about the criticisms that we're leveling against other people and the surety we have. In Washington, there's many conversations start with, well, the fact of the matter is. It's like, I didn't hear any facts before or after that statement.
Mm-hmm. So I'm always asking for advice for a KUOW listener, for a Seattleite listener. It sounds like introspection is your... I think some humility.
You may already have that in Seattle. That's why some of us come this far.
This is former UN Ambassador Rick Barton, who teaches at Princeton at the Woodrow Wilson School there, and he has served as the Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees at the UN, First Assistant Secretary of State, Conflict Stabilization under President Obama. His new book is Peace Works: America's Unifying Role in a Turbulent World. And Rick, you're speaking Wednesday at noon for a World Affairs Council event at the Westin in Seattle, right?
Yes, and it's also a Rotary event.
And a Rotary event. You can find tickets to that talk at the World Affairs Council website under events. Ambassador Rick Barton, thank you for writing. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you. Great interview.
It's The Record on KUOW. Coming right back.